Ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. Wonderful. All right, may we have the roll call, please?
Yes, just a few housekeeping items. This meeting is being live streamed and recorded on Zoom. Since you guys have all been here all day already, just turn your mics on if you want to speak so you can be heard on Zoom. Director Branscombe.
Yes.
Desmond.
Here.
Guerrero. Here. Harris. Joyner.
Here.
Thomas. Chair Thomas.
Here. Wonderful. Well, really appreciate everyone being here for this. Are there any public communications?
We do not have any public comment.
Thank you. We'll now move on to the consent calendar. It's pretty routine. Do I have a motion?
Joyner moves approval.
With motion and second, any public comment? Probably
There's no
not.
public comment.
All right. Roll call, please.
Director Branscombe.
Yes.
Desmond.
Aye.
Guerrero. Aye. Harris. Joyner.
Aye.
Chair Thomas.
Aye. All right. We now move on to item 2, the funding round kickoff. So let us begin.
All right, thank you. Want to thank everybody for signing up, participating, being a part of this. This is going to be a really important group, not just for staff, but I think overall for the board and for the region as we embark on this new funding round. We're kind of wrapping up the review of applications now from the current one, and I think with the corrective action, which we'll talk about a little bit today, there's some new things we need to think about that we haven't had to think about before as we go into thinking about a funding round and developing programs and what are we trying to get out of this. So I appreciate you all participating in this and helping us and guide us in development of that next process. I wanted to just kind of first start out and talk a little bit about how this is going to go, because we do have this group, but we also have a parallel effort that is going to be held with Public Works and Planning staff for all of the partner agencies in the region. And the intent there, as I've mentioned before, is to make sure that we're having a real robust conversation about this and hearing from the elected side and our board side what they're looking for and what they're hearing, but also from the boots on the ground, so to speak, with the folks that are actually submitting the applications and trying to understand what their needs are and how we can best address those needs. So I will be.
Hey, Christina, I'm sorry to do this, but I've just got folks are on the line are having a bit of a hard time hearing. So if you can maybe, and for everybody, I know it's a little cumbersome, but if you can just make sure you pull the mic up to you and
Sure.
all the rest of that.
Thank you. Sorry about that, whoever's listening. I'll be leading this group for staff, and Chris Doherty here from our transportation team is going to be leading the staff level group with the Public Works and Planning directors. I will be there for that as well, but the intent is to have a representative from that group participate in this group as well to make sure that the conversation is flowing and everybody's kind of hearing the same thing. We know that this can be a sensitive topic for a lot of people in the region, and so we want this to be a very transparent and collaborative process as we go forward. So I wanted to just kind of explain that a little bit. I put in front of you also a very rough kind of version of a work plan that we're looking to follow. And I wanted to just go through this really quickly, not in detail, but I think important to note is that what we're looking at doing, because I know it's really hard with schedules and such, to hold 3 meetings this year and 3 meetings next year. So this first year of meetings is very much background, very much why are we doing this? What are the guardrails that we have to work within? How does this align with other efforts like the blueprint and triple bottom line? And kind of get that good background and base so that next year in 2024, we can get into those really more detailed conversations about what the funding round will actually look like, what are the programs, how do we want this thing structured, criteria, things like that. So, so these first few meetings will really be just a learning experience, I think, for everyone. And the next meeting, I think, will be very insightful. We're going to have Garrett Ballard Rosa, who ran the last funding round, come and talk about kind of the history of how we got to the framework that we've been using, some of the discussions that we had, what that process is. Chris will speak about the current process because by June we will have awarded. So we can talk a little bit about what unfolded during this process, what went well, what didn't go well, and use that as a basis for future conversation. And then September, we'll really focus on this concept of prioritization, which is something I think we'll be talking about in the strategic planning committee and is part of the blueprint as well. So really those fundamentals. So I think it'll be a really insightful year. I think educational for us as well as hopefully for you on how these things work. I think some of you are familiar being part of the 4-county funding round, but we're going to have 2 other folks participating. And so it's really important we have these conversations. So I invite you to look over this work plan. You can always reach out to me if you have any questions, but we do have some things that we kind of wanted to go over and talk about today, some fundamentals of things like what are the funding sources that we're working with? How does this interact with the MTP and the MTIP? Just what are we doing? And the corrective action as well, always a fun topic. So I have a PowerPoint. I think.
There's a question coming in.
I do. I had one.
That was you.
Yeah. Sometimes I have to what? I don't know. Do you know how to work this thing?
Got it? Do you want me to
Yeah.
show you?
No.
Okay.
Well, it's just a little delayed.
Okay.
Did it go?
It did. Sorry. Oh, you pushed it? How do you turn it on? I'll get there today. I'll get there. Okay. So as I mentioned, just really quickly, meeting timeline regularly scheduled over the next 1.5 years. This is when we propose to have those meetings. So the work scope in front of you, the work plan in front of you kind of lays out what we're going to be talking about at each of those meetings. Today, as I mentioned, want to talk about regulatory context, just so we at least know from that what we need to be thinking about as we go through this process. So I am going to turn it over to Eric to just give you a quick reminder of the corrective action that has been in front of you lately.
Sure. Thank you. So I'm going to go over some slides you've seen before to just refresh your memory on the corrective action. But I think what I wanted to say at the outset is really what we didn't talk so much about in the corrective action process, which is it set up a process, right, that we have to use. It kind of these are the rules. But I think what we didn't really emphasize is that there's a lot of policy making that comes into that process. And so one of the outputs of this funding round working group really is to define the policy that fits within this process, right? And so there is a target setting process that we're going to be going through. But what are the things that we want to count when we're thinking about how we're going to score projects, and more importantly, how funding is equitably distributed across the region? Those are some of the factors that you'll want to wrestle with in terms of how we set the process.
What's acronyms?
Okay.
FTA?
Oh, the Federal Transit Administration and Federal Highway Administration.
They're correct or something.
Yeah. So yeah. Sure. So just a real, so I just wanted to set the stage with that, but I'll go over what the corrective action is now. So a little over 2 years ago, Federal Highway Administration and Federal Transit Administration, in their review of Caltrans, which they're required to do by federal law, they said that the state of California was not properly administering the program of the Surface Transportation Block Grant and congestion mitigation and air quality funds that come to California. And so those are things that we award in our funding rounds in the past that SACOG has done, and then El Dorado and Placer have taken those separate actions. And we have a lot of latitude in terms of what we do there, but we don't have absolute latitude. And so really, I think to put it in some layman terms, the U.S. Department of Transportation was saying, Caltrans, you're not doing an adequate job of ensuring that the MPOs are doing what we think they should be doing. And so USDOT took the opportunity to say, Caltrans, we want you to change some things in terms of how the MPO does it and ensure that it's done uniformly across the state. And the mechanism was this 2-year review that Caltrans has to undergo through the approval of a federal document. This month, we're starting our every 4-year review, and some of our peers around the state have had a corrective action directly issued to them. So this was an indirect corrective action issued to us effectively. Had we not gone through this process with Caltrans, we would have gotten a corrective action directly to us to say, you have to stop, you have to change. So the basics of what was required to change was, one, that El Dorado and Placer taking separate actions really wasn't allowed anymore. And then two, if we were going to figure out how to have the money divided around the region, that couldn't be done on the basis of population. And so what is acceptable is what's in this framework that I can go over a little bit here. I'll just pause if there's any questions there.
I'm curious, and why would they say it wouldn't be, and I don't argue with this, I'm just curious why they say it should not be based on population.
There's both,
They want merit versus population?
well, there's federal regulations that stipulate you can't do it on population.
Okay.
So it's,
Yeah, essentially, they want a competitive process. It's based on performance measures.
There you go.
Yeah.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yep. And so that's what we're really proposing to do. And I think, our objective was to ensure that our region doesn't risk losing these funds and to clear it. And we were able to sign off on a framework rather than saying we're going to have congestion and environment and equity and all other benefit, all the things worked out. They accepted that we're going to have a framework so long as we don't divide it up by population at the end of the day. And so just in brief, we have the target setting process that the board will undertake at the beginning.
Eric, can I ask you
Oh,
quickly?
sure.
I'm sorry.
Director Desmond.
And I understand that. I
Yeah,
completely agree, not by population, but population is something that should always be considered, right? And what project is affecting the most amount of people.
Yeah.
It doesn't,
sure.
the converse is it doesn't say you have to exclude population from being even discussed in a competitive funding process, correct?
That's absolutely right.
Okay.
You can, and I think that it's important to distinguish here because I think for political reasons inside the region, I think it's important to ensure that we have targets at the county level so that counties have money. But on an individual project basis, absolutely, the consideration of this has a benefit because it affects a large number of people or it has a benefit for other reasons, population, is something we definitely can't ignore.
Got it, okay.
Pardon me, at what step in that process, because there's basically steps there.
Yes,
So SACOG staff cannot suggest allocations based on population.
correct.
Isn't it interesting, though, that the board votes are based on population? I just thought I'd point out something that seemed interesting.
Wow.
It's one of 3 measures for the board vote.
Yeah,
But, there's 3 different measures, but population is heavily weighted.
yes.
And it's just reality. It's not that big a deal. So SACOG staff is going to ignore population except to the extent it's overly relevant to a decision based on other criteria.
Yeah, I hesitate to say we're going to ignore population, but
Exactly.
yeah, but it's a factor in this. I think at the end of the day, the targets is a constraint that we have, and it's an important thing that we need to talk about. What are the factors that would would justify having one county have more or less money than other counties in the region. But ultimately, the targets are just that. That isn't a guarantee for any county, even if it wasn't on population. Rather, we want to set something out, kind of like we had the discussion with ATP and Green Means to Go this morning, where we can score projects individually, and that's the part that I think is really worth focusing on. The targets is important, for a political reason and for equity within the region, but it's the assessment and how we score individual projects that I think Christina and Chris are going to talk a lot about.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
No, sounds good.
Okay, very good. Okay, so 6 County Committee is going to be reviewing the projects. Again, this is all tiering off of what the board sets out in terms of the framework for each funding round, and then staff would make a recommendation to the full board. So these are just the steps again in a little bit more detail. So I want to kind of breeze through these so that we can get on to the other parts of the overview this morning. And then this is how the prioritization process would work in each round. So maybe with that, we can transition and this may bounce back and forth to the corrective action, but.
A little bit, but so that's sort of the newest bit of information that we're working with on creating a next funding round and why we needed all 6 of you here. But the other piece of it is our funding sources and our funding round go hand in hand with our Metropolitan Transportation Plan, the MTP, which we're now working on with the blueprint, the update of that. And then that informs the implementation piece, which is the MTIP, the Metropolitan Transportation Improvement Program. All of these things need to be consistent with one another. So it's really important that we think about these things as a package and not as individual pieces of things that we do here at SACOG. So our funding round, and we'll talk a little bit about each of these sources in a moment, but our funding round comes mostly from a combination of federal and state programs. Those federal programs, for the most part, are CMAQ, which he mentioned, Congestion Management Air Quality, STBG, and then on the state side, there's STIP, which is the State Transportation Improvement Program. The state dollars are not necessarily subject to this 6 county corrective action piece. We tend to put them in our funding round as we do now with the 4 counties, so we have a larger pot of money. This is something that we will want to talk about, I think, moving forward as we think about the funding round of how does STIP fall into this? Do we continue to put it in that way? Because there are some interesting things with Placer County with their STIP. So this is why today is a very high overview. There is a lot to get into with all of these as we move forward. But all of these, anything we fund from our funding round has to be consistent with the MTP. And once we do the awards, we program those into the MTIP. So just thinking about process here. So the federal and state requirements, kind of diving a little bit more, we've got the Clean Air Act, we've got greenhouse gas reduction targets, we have equity, we have performance-based planning, which is another topic we'll get into in another meeting. The MTP SCS has to meet these federal requirements. It also has to meet some state requirements and local requirements as well. And then our MTIP, all of these projects get put into that MTIP, and they're subject to additional, air quality screening and things like that. Again, we'll get into all of this in a later meeting. But I think the most important part here that I want to focus a little bit more on, and we're going to turn it over to Chris, who leads our funding round, by the way. I don't think I introduced that. I think you all know that by now, but he is the one that is really leading the charge on this. We need to dive into the funding sources, what eligible projects are, what are we even talking about when we're looking at our funding round, and what the programs are that are available to us as we start to think about how these programs are organized, what type of criteria are we going to create for these, how are we going to be evaluating and analyzing these projects. So, Chris.
Thank you, Christina. I'll give a kind of brief overview. As we said, we take these sources of money and generally combine them, and then we approve projects and apply them to them through that TIP process as we implement them. first I'm gonna talk a little bit about the CMAQ funding, or the Congestion Management Air Quality Funding. Really, the eligibility for this program, and it's a little tight on some things, but they must, only projects that reduce air quality or can reduce congestion, or they must quantify some level of emission benefit when these projects are awarded. So sometimes we spend a lot of this money on bike ped projects, bus projects, things like that. It doesn't go into general things like road overlays and things like that, because you can't really quantify an emissions benefit from that. So this is about a third of our funding. And so it generally has a couple strings about some reporting on it. It's not very stringent, but your staff is generally is knowledgeable on that reporting. For the STPG, or sometimes we also call it RSTP funding, yes.
Just a real quick question, thinking about CMAQ. We've got a couple of bottlenecks on 80, right? Where people are slowing down and sitting in traffic. I can quantify an air quality issue with that. If we can keep that flow moving,
Absolutely.
then
Yeah, that
that
has been used for those type of projects in the past. It is
Just wanted to make
absolutely
sure we're still doing
eligible,
it.
yes. So to move into the Surface Transportation Block Grant, or we also call Regional Surface Transportation Program. This is our most flexible funding, federal funding source that we have at our disposal. It can only be used on streets that are classified as collectors and up. There's a couple tweaks in there, but this is really high level. So your local streets are not really eligible for this funding for a lot, to be used for this. But this gets used a lot for some road rehab projects and things like that because of its flexible nature. So again, this makes up about a third of our funding in general. Generally, our funding is a third CMAQ, a third STBG, and a third STIP that kind of comes in. We have some other programs that I'll talk about in a second too. And then, yeah, the STIP funding source is the state funding source. This can really only be programmed to fund a couple constraints. A fully phased portion of a project. We generally, in our terms, look at a project through 3 to 4 phases. There's 2 different phases of a design. Most of the time, a small project will group that into one phase. There's the right-of-way phase, and then there's the construction phase. So the important thing to know here is that to use this funding, it must either complete or entirely 100% fund a phase of a project. They don't want to use it to go after federal funds. It can be used to effectively, if you have local funds on a project, fill the gap until you get that next point. The other thing that is important here is it must go through the CTC for allocation. So there's additional paperwork to use this on projects. Has about a 2-month lag time to get that authorization to spend to the next phase on this. So it can add some marginal delays on a project.
Can I ask you just about
Absolutely.
So it can't be used to leverage matching funds, but what if you already have other matching funds already lined up? Can this be used
Yeah.
if it's already in place?
Yeah,
Okay.
60% of your funding for that phase, this can be used for that last 40.
Okay,
You
got it.
can't be used for that first 60 to go find that
Got it,
40.
got it,
It's
got it.
just the way they want to use it. So what we're basically talking about is some of just the complications that we have when we play Tetris with those dollars on the back end to apply them to projects, that we have to know these constraints as we do that. So that's really what we're illuminating here. There are some new programs coming down the pipe out of IIJA, or bipartisan infrastructure law, like carbon reduction, protect, safe streets for all, NEVI, and reconnecting communities. We're going to be talking more about those probably in depth later on. They're new programs. We're learning about them and we've started some conversations at the committee and board level around carbon reduction. So we'll be looking and having more details for that coming forward. But those are coming. They're not as large as the other programs, but we'll have them at our disposal or be supporting our agencies going after those things in the future.
One thing to clarify on that, I think we have a lot of interesting new programs coming out to facilitate projects that may have been otherwise difficult to push along, especially with the NEVI and the Safe Streets for All. Those will primarily continue to be competitive at the federal level. So that will be more on the grant side. The carbon reduction program is the one, and there was an item in the receive and file in this board packet that has the opportunity to potentially be integrated into our funding round in some way, because we get those funds just like we get CMAQ and we get STBG from the federal government. So it is an MPO that receives the funding, and we are required by federal law to distribute those fundings through a competitive 6-county process that is now dictated a lot by carbon reduction. So that is an item that we'll be bringing forward. You had information, Transportation Committee got an actual presentation on it earlier this month, but that is one that we're starting to consider a little bit more of how are we going to use these funds? What are they going to be good for? How is this going to impact our funding round moving forward? So just a little note on that specific source.
Pardon me, how much are any of these highly susceptible to the political winds in Washington?
I mean, sure. Sure, but carbon reduction is part of the 5-year, it's guaranteed for 5 years, so to speak. It's one that there's some chatter that we hear could be a potential longer term program, kind of like CMAQ is. We don't know that for sure, but we do know that we have that money for 5 years.
Was that by regulation or was that by act of Congress, do you know?
So this is by act of Congress. So it's a 5-year authorization
No,
and
that's-
then the
that's-
annual
that's fixed.
appropriations.
Okay.
It is,
Yeah,
I'm
That's
just
not
curious,
changing.
are there going to be moving targets? That's all I was asking.
No.
No.
It's
no.
really, the thing that may change is the competitive grants that stay with the U.S. Department of Transportation may change administration to administration. Congress, sometimes directs them on what to do with those, but. the
Yeah,
funds for us
so
are good.
we know, for instance, for carbon reduction, we have about $4.2 million a year that will be coming to our region over the next 5 years. So $22, $23 million is what we'll have to work with for the next 5 years. There's some interesting things with it. The first year of funds needs to be obligated by 2025, which is why we sort of started to escalate the conversation about carbon reduction with you all, so that we can figure out what we do with at least that first year, so it doesn't get lost in the shuffle. But some of the future years, we have some time to figure out how we're going to work with them. So on the fund,
Before we move on, I do have a quick question.
Yeah.
Refresh my memory, and I think it's important to recognize that when we're talking about CMAQ, STBG funds and STIP, that the funds that this working group is looking at is only a small portion of all of the funding that flows through SACOG. Is that correct? Is it like 8%? I think I heard that somewhere.
So not that flows through SACOG. This is all the money that flows through SACOG, except for ATP.
Correct.
It's of the overall Metropolitan Transportation Plan.
Okay,
So that's $35 billion or so plan, right? All of the dollars assumed in that plan are largely monies that go directly to cities and counties.
okay, great. That's helpful.
This is the 7%.
Okay, thank you very much.
thanks. So I'll pause. Does anyone have any questions about the funding sources? Because it is a complicated topic.
I think Wendy had a good question. Could you maybe say your answer again? It sounded like I missed something.
Sure.
It sounded very
Sure, yeah.
interesting, though.
Sure, I'll kind of expand a little bit on that. Okay, so the long-range plan they developed that has a 20-year shelf life, or it has a 20-year horizon, it's $35 billion. Of the funds assumed in that $35 billion number, it includes local option sales tax measures. It includes the funds that flow directly from the state of California, from the gas tax to your jurisdictions for road maintenance. It includes developer impact fees for developments, for interchanges or for road improvements. All those things are assumed in the 35 billion. 7% of 35 billion is the federal funds that flow to SACOG that we award out. Yeah, so in terms of, right, how we shape where our region goes, we only have 7% to steer the rudder.
So we're talking about the 7% we're going to get, the rest we're going to get otherwise.
That's
You know?
right, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Right.
That helps.
Based on population.
But it's an important 7%.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that for the remainder of the time we have today, I want to talk about what exactly we're doing here, why we're here. So we're not here to sit and talk about funding sources for the next year and a half. It's important, but it's not why we're here. I really want to talk about the goals we have as a group, not just as a group, but as an organization as we go into this funding round. So some of the high level goals that I had shared earlier on when we started talking about the funding round working group is really, there's goals for us at staff, which is to understand what our partner agencies are thinking, what are their struggles, what do we need to try to address as staff when we're talking about a fundamental program. But for the working group, as I also mentioned, it's to understand the context that we're operating in, to understand the constraints that we're in, but also to provide direction on where we should be going. And collectively, we need to get buy-in on this process and buy-in in what we're doing. But on top of all of that, this is where the kind of kumbaya moments come into play here. But what are we really trying to achieve here? Like, what are the outcomes that we want as a group? What are the issues that we should be addressing that you hear about? We know we talk a lot about equity, right? And equity is a very, difficult topic to talk about depending on what community you're in. What are the projects that we're talking about? So I want to just have an open conversation today about what are the things that are going to be driving us as we move forward in this process. So it's kind of an option for you to all just be able to, what have you been hearing? I'm sure that you have a lot of your public works directors and other directors coming to you with a lot of, comments about our process and what we're doing wrong and what we're doing hopefully well as well. But, just this is an opportunity to start to talk about what are we going to be looking at? What is going to shape all of our future discussions as we move forward? And I want to kind of bring equity to the table. There's equity, there's CAPDI, there's a lot of things that we are going to have to address, but we need to work with you to figure out how we're going to do it. Oh yeah, do you all know what CAPDI? Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure. It's a California thing that was put, I know, there's so many acronyms. We're gonna print out a list for you all so that you know what we're talking about. Yeah, well, and there's a lot in there about the whole climate side, but there is equity built into that as well. So there's a lot of regulations, and what I might suggest that we do is put together a primer on some of these things that we can send out to you, so that as we talk about, it's going to come up a lot, whether it's here or anywhere else. CAPDI is like a buzzword. We are. Let's do it. I mean, so what are you talking about when you're talking about equity?
Director, if you could just use the mic.
Well, for a county like Placer,
Right.
And you heard Joe Gallardo talking about not having disadvantaged communities. How do we define disadvantaged communities? I've got a very, very large Del Webb population that have mobility challenges coming up. Is that a disadvantaged community? Not in the typical way that we would look at it, but for me it is. There are significant impacts on that community. So how do we begin to frame that? I don't have some of the, I have a reasonably well-to-do population, young families that don't have some of the challenges that the more urban areas have. So how are we, I just want to get a circle around it so we know what we're talking about rather than have it be this fluid, ever-changing, uncertain thing.
I think there's a lot to discuss on it. There are things like Justice 40. There are some federal requirements that we have that do define disadvantaged communities. That doesn't mean that that's what we have to keep it to, but I think there's some core concepts that we need to keep at the heart of what equity is. I think one of the important things that we talked about last night, actually, with Nick Donahue, as he did a little discussion on their prioritization process with their funding, which is a state level process. But one of the interesting things that he reiterated a lot, which I thought was really interesting, was no project is going to score really well on every single one of their criteria. And as he kind of showed what some of the projects were that had won funding through their process, they might have scored really low on equity, but scored really high on safety or really high on environmental benefits or things like that. And I think what it does is it encourages our partners, or it encouraged their partners, and if we follow some kind of semblance of the process, encourage our partners to focus on the issues that are truly meaningful and will truly move the needle, rather than trying to like say our project will do everything. I think there's an opportunity to recognize that there are some areas that have, will have really, really strong benefits over here. And there are some agencies that will have really, really strong benefits over here. But if you're scoring high on all of them, that just isn't going to happen. So I guess what I'm saying is that I think as we think about the process moving forward, there will be some built-in flexibility potential in that the recognition that you're not going to be able to hit the mark on every single thing because not every single community is the same. But with that said, equity is something that we should all be thinking about and trying to understand at our different communities what it does mean, what it does look like. I don't know that we can define equity as like for the funding round, what exactly that means. I kind of think that there's the opportunity for the agencies to be able to vocalize and discuss what that means and why it's important for their projects. But I think it is a consideration that we absolutely have to have in all of our projects and evaluations.
I'm at a
Yeah, so-
disadvantage. Oh, sorry, because I can't see the directors. I apologize. So, actually, I'd like to just briefly piggyback on that. So, are you saying that while we have some federal and some defined parameters on which to view equity and disadvantaged communities that we need to take into consideration on our prioritization, that this group can also make recommendations for additional categories that we want to consider in terms of prioritization?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Thank you.
Mhm.
Well, first I want to thank you for your leading it off by quoting Admiral James Stockdale from the 1992 presidential campaign, "Why am I here?" But I appreciate
Hobby of
that,
mine.
No, but, and just so I'm clear, and when I reference closed session, because I don't like asking questions that embarrass me, which is typically what happens, but if we were to have this group would have convened a few years ago, Placer and El Dorado County wouldn't even have been at the table. That's correct, right? Okay.
Yep.
So that's why it's new in that regard. But in terms of the equity piece, I mean, obviously Sacramento County, I mean, you look at state definitions when we're talking equity and environmental justice communities, and there are a lot of definitions out there that speak to that, to what that means.
Yeah.
So I just want to make sure, I mean, I understand that this group may have some flexibility in perhaps broadening that definition, but I'd be more comfortable with just making sure that that equity piece is not exclusive, right? I mean, like you said, it's only one of several factors.
Right.
But I just would be uncomfortable straying too far from a definition that is
Oh.
really informed by, state law and federal law and needs in some of these, communities.
Absolutely. And I think that will be the core of it. And I think when I discussed flexibility, it is more on that side of there are other criteria that we are going to be developing and looking at, that it provides flexibility in how projects are. What is your strength? Like, let's focus on the core strengths of the project so that we're actually making a difference. If safety and environmental quality are the two things that really make that project shine, then focus on those things, because if you start to kind of stray away from what the strengths are, you're going to dilute the project and the value that the project may have in your community. But again, I will stress, equity should be a consideration no matter what, as we are thinking about the development of projects. And I think that's a lot where we come in with staff when we talk about pre-application process and talk about the projects that you're going to be putting in. One of our jobs is to understand what you're trying to achieve and how we can make it a very meaningful project to a variety of different communities or whatever it might be. So I think there's a lot of pre-steps that go into just the submitting of the project to go into our funding round. It's our job to work with you all to understand, like, how can you think about equity in this, and how can you maybe strengthen that aspect of a project, or are there projects that will have more benefit in a disadvantaged community than not? So it's a complicated process. Equity is a very difficult thing to
If I can
address.
just add on to that, Christina, I think thinking too about the quantitative and qualitative
Yeah.
measure of these things is really important, right? Because equity is typically, like in the definitions you're stating, is a geographically based thing, but transportation is not about place, it's about mobility, right? And so how do we assess that? And I think we just need to keep these things on the table of like, what are the things that we can easily measure? And we'll be honest with you about, we have a measure for this, we don't have a measure for that, and keeping that part of like how we're evaluating projects moving forward.
Y'all are going to be doing the real work in bringing these things forward. And I just want to be corrected if I'm wrong on this. It would seem to me that equity is the least susceptible, the element that is least susceptible to objective metrics. Much of the other criteria are susceptible to objective metrics, and the equity calculation is probably a little bit more, not totally subjective. There's going to be an element of objectivity in there. For example, it'd be interesting to know on a project, okay, we see this criteria, and how did you evaluate equity? I think that would be my question as a director, because y'all will be doing that work. And I'm impressed by the way you're approaching it, particularly your description, Christina, you went into it in great depth. It is difficult, and it'll be interesting here. And 99 times out of 100, I'm going to go with you because you guys are much closer to this.
I'm glad you have faith. No, you're right. And we don't have an answer for that right now, because that is part of this process, is to come up with what are the criteria that we're going to be looking at and how are we going to be evaluating these things. I think right now, the tools built into the funding round can definitely be improved as they relate to equity. And Eric pointed out a really important distinction too. There's the qualitative and there's the quantitative. And when you get into the qualitative, that's where it becomes a little bit more challenging, because there's no numbers attached to it. There's no data behind it necessarily at the same degree you would otherwise. So, you know, that as we start to next year talk about these things and how we're going to have criteria, these are the things that we're going to really dive into of what are we talking about with equity? How are we going to evaluate equity? And I'm confident that we'll get there, and I'm confident that we'll all come out of this with a process that makes sense. But I don't think it's going to be easy.
Again, real quickly, I think most of us come from worlds where we've dealt with objective metrics. And when you get one that's less susceptible, I'm not going to say it's purely subjective. I just think it's less susceptible to objective metrics. We're going to have to go with your judgment, as long as you know, and you guys, I'm certain you'll be able to explain that to us.
We
when
will.
it came to those decisions.
Okay.
So let me just jump in and be very direct, if I may. Those of you who may not know, it was just said that in previous years, Placer and El Dorado would not be at the table. Having the funding that we have been accustomed to thrown into the pot, and now being at the table, but afraid of being on the menu, that's where we begin to worry about this equity definition. What does that look like? And is that going to cause funding to shift to areas that we simply don't have within our county, and to areas where population, even though we're not considering it, may drive equity? And so that is going to be our ongoing concern, is how we keep this fair, frankly.
And I'm going to piggyback on Director Joyner's comments, that I think the other consideration is, how can we continue to maintain the flexibility and the local control? Because as we know, that no one knows our communities and our needs better than those of us that are, on the front lines. And so that will be an important consideration, going on. And I know the corrective action has certainly taken that into consideration, but that will be an ongoing topic of discussion, I'm sure. So do we have any, I see that we have some public comments, Christina, is that true?
I believe, Chair Thomas, there may be folks online who want to make a public comment.
Okay, great.
Well, can I, oh, sorry.
I just want to add about equity that, you know, we can take a look at it as you described from a broader lens, but taking a look at the amount of money that we're going to be discussing here, I think does limit our scope to some extent. When I think of equity, I think of opportunities that this funding provides for local jobs, for individuals that are, you know, don't have the skill and the capacity to get accessible jobs. And it provides, you know, an opportunity for training. There may be a lot of difference of opinion on that, but that's one area of equity. The other is enhancing the environment of those that have been disadvantaged for many years. And that's why I'm very grateful for the funding that we received, because we are going to accomplish fulfilling one of those goals. That would be the equity goal here. And listening to Director Mai Vang asking the question about that particular metric being disqualified for being a recipient of a grant, maybe taking a look at that as a potential, you know, making sure that whoever's putting the application in, that it is a metric that can be applied across the board. That was the only thought that I had. Is it something that, you know, we can evaluate equally, and making sure that whenever we receive this money. But I do appreciate Director Branscom's comment about metrics and how do we calculate that in a way that we can see that this funding is making a difference in the community. So those are some thoughts.
No, and I appreciate that, because it's not whether or not there's a disadvantaged community present, right? It's more of what are the benefits to disadvantaged communities, or what is being added to their quality of life, right? Like better access to jobs, as you pointed out. We know that congestion can be more prevalent in areas with disadvantaged communities. So therefore, air quality issues are more prevalent there. How can we minimize those types of impacts? It's not just simply, is this something that exists or not? It's more nuanced than that. And I think that's where we can start to really dig into what equity means for criteria within our funding round, so that we are truly addressing what the root causes are that we need to focus on. So I appreciate that.
I was going to say that basically exactly the same thing. In my opinion, the equity, there's various definitions out there, but is making sure everybody has equal access to jobs and to quality of life issues. It's really as simple as that. And I think that should be a high priority, right behind safety. Make sure everybody has equal opportunity to get to and from and to assume their full potential.
All right, we're coming upon the top of the hour. I might suggest that we take public comment right now and then bring it back to the directors for any final comments and discussion.
Yeah, Jessica, can you bring in the public comment, please? Woody Deloria, you have 3 minutes to make a comment.
Thank you, directors. Woody Deloria, Executive Director of the El Dorado County Transportation Commission. Really pleased and excited to see this group convening today for the first time to embark on this new funding round strategy going forward in the 6-county region. I just wanted to touch on a couple of quick things. One being that, yes, in rural El Dorado County and Placer counties, we do struggle to identify geographic areas that meet many of the disadvantaged requirements, given the metrics that are already out there and the tools that are used to measure those. However, we have been successful over the last number of years in identifying those cohorts and coming up with creative ways to represent them in applications for the Active Transportation Program and other state and federal programs that are available. And this really reminds me of early days when innovation was the emerging metric in transportation investment, and innovation is not the same across the region. For example, innovation in Pollock Pines is a sidewalk, whereas in downtown Sacramento, that's not an innovative project. So we do hope to work with the SACOG staff, and we know that they're on board to help us identify those disadvantaged and underserved cohorts in El Dorado County, in the rural regions. In our case, it may be elderly residents, people with limited access to transit, limited access to even single occupant vehicles that they own themselves. So we will certainly be committed to identifying those equity cohorts across the rural region as we move forward through this process. So thank you all.
Thank you, Woody. Appreciate your comments. Is there anyone else online, Christina?
There is no other public comment.
All right, wonderful. Well, I'll bring this back to the working group for final comments.
Wendy, I said a quick comment, Rich Desmond.
You bet.
So something kind of, I guess, a few years ago, before my tenure on this body, there was a discussion about funding, the whole formulaic thing, which I know for a number of reasons is obviously not advisable. But I think about Placer and El Dorado County, if all of a sudden we're throwing our money into the mix, you've always had that control. You always had that assurance that it was going to be staying with you. And I know it's only 7%, but 7% of $35 billion is real money over the course of several years. Will there be, on some level, over the course of time, a look to see, hey, you know what, this jurisdiction has never received anything, right? So over the course of several years, and I thought about it in the context of your comment, of your comments this morning, is that on one, you can't look at things in just one given year, but over the course of time, look at equity from a more intuitive, I guess, sense in terms of equity among all of the participating members of SACOG. Will that be part of, I guess, kind of the global consideration when we look at funding projects year to year, James?
Director Desmond, again, this is James Corliss for folks online. Thank you for the question. Absolutely, right. And I think part of what I may not have articulated this morning, Director Branscombe, is if you actually look at even in the fall, the state active transportation program around, Yuba County got a $20 million grant, and that's fantastic, right? If over repeated cycles, your jurisdiction is getting goose eggs, is getting shut out, like we need to all ask ourselves some hard questions, right? And we need to go back, I think, and iterate on criteria that, that a smaller jurisdiction, or we're going to take your pick, right, is just not winning, is just not getting funded in this funding round. Then I would say, because we know that all of you have needs, right? From Sac County to Ileton to Colfax to Live Oak, everybody has a transportation need. We have to fund the best projects that move the needle on a set of performance measures. Some of those are required from the feds, others are our regional plan, and they have to meet your local needs, right? So that's a thin needle to thread. But yeah, absolutely. Over time, you cannot guarantee any one jurisdiction or one county a percentage of like, don't worry, you'll be. But if we're shutting some people out and others are, way exceeding, then I think we all have to ask those questions. I think the other thing, I know I've said this morning, but and I know it's it's a little bit different, but the two actions you took this morning on funding were 6 county funding rounds, right? And yes, you made comments, and many people made comments about, hey, I didn't get funded this time, but those are 6 county funding rounds. So and with the partnership we've got with El Dorado and Placer, and this Director Joyner, right? And also all of our jurisdictions and public works folks, there's a way that we are now going to have to, but I feel optimistic. We got some time. We can work on a 6 county approach to this that has some flexibility, right? That you feel good about. And I do think, Christina was mentioning Nick Donahue, the other presentation he gave some of your staff yesterday was the state of Virginia's approach to actually a performance-based prioritization process across the entire state of Virginia, so rural, suburban, and urban, and that over time, people saw how they could do better. Christine was mentioning, they didn't all win in every category. They didn't all do well in every category, but different contexts, right, achieve different kind of results. So this is a good time for this discussion. We're not completely crunched by we got to figure this out next month. So it's important we do the work. It's important we're transparent, right? We have these questions and these discussions on geographic equity as well as socioeconomic and racial equity. Those are the right questions you're asking this morning. I think it's or this afternoon. So it's a good way to start this off.
I think just to kind of close on that too, one of the things Chris and I have talked about is, we always do a sort of post-mortem, right, on a funding round. But I think it would be really interesting to kind of go back a few years and see what sort of trends we can look at, how many applications were submitted by jurisdictions, how many were awarded, and see what it has looked like over the years, because maybe there's maybe there's something we can do as an agency to help them figure out what is going to be competitive and help them focus their efforts so that it actually matters. Okay. See, we're here to help. We're here to help. No, because truly, I mean, we want to see the region succeed, right? And so, we need to be a resource to your staffs as well. And it's important for us to kind of look back at what's gone wrong, what's worked, what hasn't. So we'll be doing that.
I'll add quickly that we start a funding round by going out and having one-on-one meetings with all the jurisdictions that can apply to us. And then we'll end it actually with that feedback cycle as well that we'll get from those review groups, just like you heard today from Dustin. So it's definitely part of our process if it was not articulated here today.
Thank you for doing that.
Well, Chris and Christina and all of our SACOG staff, we thank you for your diligent efforts. This is an inordinate task to allocate this funding and to work with all of our jurisdictions to make sure that we do meet the federal and state metrics as well as meet the needs of our region. And so just want to acknowledge your efforts and look forward to this evolving process. I also want to express my deep appreciation to all of our SACOG staff for working with our partner agencies to come to a workable agreement on the corrective action, as well as pulling us together in this working group so that we can dialogue about and make policy recommendations on how we can move this forward for our region. So this is a new thing, and just really look forward to working with all of you on this working group, as well as our staff to move this forward. It's an exciting time, and I have no doubt that with all of our dedicated efforts, we can do this. So are there any final comments? Or James, do you have any final comments?
If I may, real quickly, I'm new, still fairly new to SACOG. And this is the first, other than 2 days ago, had direct contact via Zoom in a meeting that Christina was in. I'm impressed by y'all. And it's really important because a board like this is going to be putting so much faith and trust in what y'all are doing. And this is a good start. Thank you.
James, do you have any final comments?
No final comments.
All right. Well, thank you all for being here, and I look forward to being with you in person next time. And to Christina and Chris and Eric and everyone, thank you so much for pulling this together, and look forward to working with you.
Thank you. Likewise.
Bye-bye.